Welcome to Wars the Roses. And this video is on the origin and history of the Christian Bible. Taken from Horizon, Journal of the Philosophical Research Society, Volume 13, Number 3, Winter 1954. The origin and history of the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible, consisting of two distinct works, the Old Testament and the New Testament, has often been called the most wonderful book in the world. It is not generally known, however, that the Bible has a long, strange history, many parts of which are obscure and confused. Even though the Bible, as we know it, is less than 2,000 years old, the circumstances leading to its compilation have never been clarified. Even the history of the Old Testament has been compiled from legend and lore rather than adequate records. If we choose to reflect upon some of the more abstract aspects of this religious literary mystery, we shall not depart from an approved procedure. First, it will be proper to summarize available information. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, except for fragments, which we know in Chaldean or Aramaic. There are sufficient historical and theological references to indicate that rolls or scrolls of the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, were in existence several centuries before the beginning of the Christian era. Yet none of these original rolls seem to have survived. We have tablets of clay from the valley of the Euphrates and manuscripts of papyrus from ancient Egypt, which have withstood the vandalisms of both men and time. It is strange, therefore, that we should be without such source material in the case of the Old Testament. Recent excavations in the Near East seem to promise that early Hebrew books may have been hidden in boxes or jars, and will come to life in the course of time. Broadly speaking, however, scholars have concluded that the earliest comprehensive manuscripts of the Old Testament in Hebrew date from the 9th or 10th century AD, and are therefore only about 1,000 years old. Even assuming that war, pillage, and the disperia resulting in the destruction of many ancient works, it would seem that some should have escaped. It is scarcely less strange that Jewish communities between the 1st and 9th centuries AD should not have produced manuscripts for the use of their congregations. The New Testament, as a collective work, is known only through early Greek manuscripts. Some have assumed that it was recorded in Greek, but this seems rather strange when we realize that during the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the descent of the faith was largely in the keeping of Jewish Christians. Greek was the language of scholars, and these were not abundant in the early historical descent of Christianity. Little is known about the New Testament until the end of the 3rd or beginning of the 4th century AD. 3 important manuscripts were prepared at this time. They are the Codex Vaticanicus, or Codex B, Codex Alexandrinus, or Codex A, and the Codex Sinaiticus, or Codex Alpha. The first of these is in the Vatican Library, and the other 2 are in the British Museum. These manuscripts are called uncials because they are written entirely in capital letters. Incidentally, there was no punctuation or spacing between words. It was customary to put as many words on a line as could be read conveniently without pausing for breath. There was a second type of manuscript of Greek origin, known as the cursive, in which the writing combined capital and small letters, and a running hand was employed. These are later than the uncials, and are regarded as less important. Comparative value for scholars is based upon the important consideration that the uncials are the sources from which the cursive texts were taken. less than 100 unicell manuscripts of the Bible, or parts thereof, are known to exist, and only two, the Vaticanicus and the Sinaiticus, are sufficiently complete to indicate the original scope of the writing. There are about 3,000 cursive manuscripts in Greek, dating from 10th to the 16th centuries. These are sometimes useful to scholars, but do not solve the principal problem. That is, the determination of the original text of the two testaments. About the year BC 280, the most famous version of the Old Testament was prepared in Alexandria for the use of the Jewish colony in Egypt. According to legend, this was undertaken by 72 Jewish scholars who came from Palestine, and they completed their labor in 72 days. According to one account, these translators, editors, and scribes worked separately and then compared their translations, which, by the grace of God, were absolutely identical. The edition produced by these learned men is known as the Septuagint, or the version of the 70. 2 points in connection with this work are of special significance. The Septuagint was originally prepared in Greek, which had become the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean area. Even more interesting is the fact that the Septuagint was the version of the Old Testament in general use at the time of Jesus and his apostles, and references to the Old Testament in the Gospels and epistles are from this version. Those parts of the Old Testament which occur in the Sinaitic, Vatican, and Alexandrian manuscripts are according to the Septuagint version. It is assumed, on reasonable grounds, that the translators and editors of the Septuagint made use of the earlier Hebrew manuscripts, which are not known to have survived, unless further research in the field of biblical archaeology brings new material to light. It must be assumed that the Septuagint is the source work for existing versions and interpretations of the Old Testament. The Codex Vaticanicus and the Codex Sinaiticus are about the same date, and there has been speculation upon the possibility that some scribes worked on both manuscripts. The Vaticanicus lacks the first 46 chapters of Genesis, 32 of the Psalms, all of Hebrews after the 9th chapter, the 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and the book of Revelation. This manuscript, dating from the 4th century AD, has been in the Vatican Library since the 15th century, except for a brief period when it was brought to Paris by Napoleon I. The Codex Sinaiticus was discovered about the middle of the 19th century in the convent of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. It was found by Dr. Tischendorf, who unfortunately did not make the discovery until 2 bundles of the ancient leaves had been burned as waste paper. With considerable difficulty, Dr. Tischendorf was finally able to bring the balance of the manuscript to Russia, where it was officially presented to the Emperor Alexander II in a ceremony at the Winter Palace. Through the financial assistance of the Tsar, Dr. Tischendorf produced a facsimile of the Codex for the use of scholars throughout the world. It originally contained both testaments complete, but a considerable part of the Old Testament was lost. About 20 years ago, the Codex Sinaiticus was acquired by the British Museum from the Russian government as a national treasure. The Codex Alexandrinus is also defective. Its origin is unknown, but it is believed to date from the 5th or 6th century AD. The most famous Latin version is known as the Vulgate, which intimates from its name that it was translated into the vulgar tongue, as distinguished from the Greek. The enormous task was undertaken by Saint Jerome at the request of Pope Damasus. Jerome was a scholar of outstanding ability and had studied at Constantinople under Gregory Nazianzus. He began his work as a translator about 384 AD and completed the project about 404 AD. Apparently, the original intention was to revise old Latin versions, but it gradually became apparent that a complete revision was necessary. St. Jerome was severely criticized for the changes which he made, but with the passing of time, the Vulgate increased in popularity. It underwent several further revisions and is now the standard text of the Roman Catholic Church. By the 6th century, manuscripts in several languages, including Coptic and Syrian, were in circulation. Broadly speaking, however, these add very little on the level of source material. After the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Septuagint version lost favor among the Jewish scholars and rabbis, and an effort was made to prepare a new version with special consideration for the doctrines of the Pharisees. The result was the Old Testament revised by Aquila, which was used for a long time in the synagogues. During this significant period, reverence for the letter of the Scriptures increased rapidly and affected all subsequent editions. It became increasingly difficult to correct errors and inconsistencies, and tradition seriously crippled scholarship. This attitude has remained and is strongly noticeable in connection with revisions attempted during the last 50 years. A total attitude of veneration is now attached even to English translations of the Bible, and there are so many devout believers who do not seem to realize that the Scriptures were not originally revealed in the English language. A comprehension of modern translations in various languages shows remarkable, if unimportant, variations. In the French Bible, the reference to the meek in the Beatitudes is improved by rendering the word meek as debonair. In Chinese translations, the word Tao is used for God, but this would in no way reveal to a Chinese convert the Christian concept of deity. Barriers of language are difficult to overcome because of the inevitable semantic overtones. A leaf from an Armenian manuscript Bible from 1121 AD. This example is written in the Hayakhan alphabet called iron writing, an early paper of the Near East. This version was the cause of continual controversy between the Greek and Roman churches. Note unusual illumination on the border. From the 10th century to the invention of printing about 1450 AD, the number of Bible manuscripts increased rapidly, but they were principally copies for the use of monasteries, churches, and noble families. Although intended to be faithful reproductions of earlier works, minor changes were made, partly due to the limited capabilities of the scribes and partly the result of earlier inconsistencies, faithfully preserved or interpreted. For example, a scribe checking his work would find out he had left out a word, so he would place it in the margin. A later copyist would carefully repeat the procedure or attempt to discover the secret motive behind the previous error. Many old manuscripts developed marginalia, and it became impossible to determine the sources of these annotations. Sometimes they were omitted as irrelevant but not infrequently, efforts were made to insert them as parts of the original text. This is one reason why the great codices of the 4th and 5th centuries are so valuable to editors of the Bible. We now know that in the early days, biblical manuscripts were cherished as relics. They were rare, difficult to secure, and beyond the comprehension of the illiterate. It was therefore customary to keep them in some safe place where they could be consulted on rare occasions by a privileged few. Later, when monastic libraries and royal or ecclesiastical collections of books came into existence, Bibles were frequently chained to racks or lecterns, and many were equipped with ponderous locks. The laity was discouraged from making use of them. Short texts and prayers were considered sufficient for the common need. The Bible as a book, therefore, was comparatively unknown, and the problems which plagued scholars never reached the devout to perturb their peace of mind. After Charles the Great, Charlemagne became the patron of European learning, and the monasteries expanded under his edict to become cloister schools. The foundations of education broadened. The laity and the sons of the noble families especially were encouraged to improve their minds in letters and the humanities. The demand for books increased, and this undoubtedly hastened the era of the printed book. Illiteracy was no longer synonymous with gentility, and royal fashions decreed the gentle arts of learning. A leaf from a 12th century French manuscript Bible, a fine example of the Carolingian book hand written on vellum. The writing is excellent, but the Latinity is often corrupt and, in some cases, unintelligible. In the closing years of the 9th century, a Chinese dignitary who was later executed for political conspiracy appears to have invented printing. He caused wood carvers to cut inscriptions and writings on flat slabs of wood. These slabs were then rubbed with ink made of charcoal and oil, and impressions taken therefrom on thin sheets of paper. This was a development from an earlier fashion of making rubbering from inscriptions on stone. Wood block printing spread rapidly in Asia, and the oldest known example of a book prepared by this method, the Diamond Sutra of Buddha, dates from the 9th century. The art also reached Korea, and at about the 12th century, the Koreans had the happy thought of cutting the letters separately so that they could be used in different arrangements. They cast their first movable type in clay, but later cut it in wood or metal. They were most heroic in their ingenuity when we realized that a font of such type required more than 10,000 different characters. Paper had already reached Europe along the trade routes from the Near East. The Egyptian papyrus monopoly had resulted in the substitution of vellum, and the expense involved in the proper preparation of skins made paper a welcome commodity. Although the situation is not entirely clear, we know that woodblock printing existed in Europe prior to the time of Gutenberg and Faust. It seems probable that printing reached Europe and Asia, at least as a tradition of method, and was not actually invented in Germany as is generally supposed. To Gutenberg, or one of the other contenders for the honor, should go the credit for the construction of the first printing press. It was also exceedingly reasonable that the first printed book of Western civilization should be the Holy Bible, which was issued between 1445 and 1450. and is one of the rarest printed works in existence. The original translation was not entirely honorable, as the printers attempted to distribute this Bible as a handwritten work at the fantastic prices that then prevailed for manuscripts. They were forced to reveal the secret to escape the extreme displeasure of the church, which developed the quaint notion that the devil was behind the project. The modern term, printer's devil, originated in the idea that the prince of evil operated the old hand press in his spare time. The story of the Bible after the invention of printing is largely an account of early printers, their difficulties and tribulations, and the extraordinary work which they accomplished with hopelessly inadequate equipment. Bibles of the 15th century are among the great incunabula, or cradle books. This term is applied to editions made during the first 50 years of printing in Europe. Today, these wonderful works are still accepted as the finest examples of printing art. It has been said by experts that printing is only art which has never evolved. The first examples are still the finest. In the beginning, printing Bibles were merely reproductions of old manuscripts, but as printing itself expanded into many fields, the level of scholarship rose and the human mind began to inquire into subjects previously ignored or forbidden. There were handsome editions of the scriptures in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, German, and English. By the 16th century, polyglot began to appear, in which several older versions were presented together as parallel texts. Even before the Reformation, these translations, in some instances, brought disaster to their authors. In passing, mention should be made of the works of such men as Tyndale, Coverdale, and a man known as Thomas Matthew, whose real name may have been John Rogers. Later editions included the Camera Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and finally the Authorized Bible, so named because it was undertaken by command of King James I of England. Although we hear much about such Bibles and others, such as Erasmus and the Lutheran, there is so much misunderstanding about these works in the popular mind. A careful study would indicate that the differences between 16th and 17th century Bibles are due either to their origin in previous versions or to peculiarities of translation from one language to another. In many cases, they differ only in an occasional word, and, except with typographical errors appear, there is slight change of meaning. It has been pointed out that more than 150,000 reading differences occur, but probably not 1% of these is worthy of consideration. The persecutions which often accompanied new versions of the scriptures had little to do with the texts involved, but rather with the religious convictions held by the schismatic sects who sponsored the publications. In the case of Luther, the situation was somewhat more exaggerated, as he failed to include the book of Revelation because he doubted its divine inspiration. A leaf from the Aldine Greek Bible of 1518 AD. This is the first complete Bible printed in Greek. The text is largely based upon the compilation Vulgate for the Old Testament and upon the first edition of the Erasmus version of the New Testament in Greek. The Great King James Bible appeared in 1611 in two editions, which are referred to as the He Bible and the She Bible due to typographical error. The editors and revisers were already heavily burdened by the problem of veneration already mentioned. King James was not a distinguished scholar in his own right, but was moved by division within the Church of England. Two versions of the Bible were then in common use, the clergy favoring the Bishop's Bible, and the people, including the Puritans, preferring the Geneva Bible. The Puritans brought their case to the king, who called a conference at Hampton Court Palace, which convened on January 14, 1604. This resulted in the selection of 54 outstanding scholars, of whom 47 actually carried on the project. In the instructions given by the king, preserved by Fuller in his church history, the first admonition is especially significant. The original Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, to be followed and as little altered as the original will permit. Examination proved that the editors followed the king's pleasure with the greatest care. As a result, the text of the authorized version has been polished but not materially altered. It is somewhat of an exaggeration, therefore, to assume that it is actually a work of basic scholarship. The modern printings of the authorized version differ in some degree from the original of 1611. The principal change has been the omission of the Apocrypha, and there have been a few changes in spelling and punctuation. The extremely interesting prologue, the translators to the reader, no longer appeared because of controversial elements involving the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. The principal typographical errors of the first printing were a repetition of 3 lines in Exodus 14:10 and the little difficulty which arose in Ruth 3:15. In the first issue, the last clause of the verse reads, "And he went into the city." In the second issue of the same year, this was corrected to read, "And she went into the city." Incidentally, there have been many curious translations or errors that have crept into Bibles at various times, and these have, in many instances, been used to distinguish printings or versions. The Geneva Bible is often called the Breeches Bible because of the translation of Genesis 3:7, and they sewed fig tree leaves together and made themselves breeches. The Bug Bibles gained their distinction from a remarkable rendition of Psalms 91:5. "Thou shalt not need to be afraid for any bugs by night." The meaning should have been terrors or bugaboos, and not insects. Gamblers will be interested in a curious mistake in Matthew 5:9, where it reads, "Blessed are the placemakers," instead of peacemakers. Baum in Gilead got into difficulties in the Douay Catholic Bible of 1609, where Jeremiah 8:22 reads, "Is there no rosin in Gilead?" Some other versions have preferred treacle, now spelled treacle, and more or less identified with molasses. The Vinegar Bible of 1717 announces in the headline to Luke 20, the parable of the vinegar. We also have appreciation for the improvement of Psalms 119, 161, where it says, "Printers have persecuted me instead of princes." A high spot among these dilemmas is the Wicked Bible of 1631. In this version, Exodus 20:14 is strongly revised to read, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Such misprintings are too numerous to describe them all, but the printer of the Wicked Bible was fined the sum of £300 for his contribution to delinquency. A leaf of the Gutenberg Latin Bible of 1497 AD. This is from the Vulgate version and includes the commentary of Nicholas de Lyra, 1270 to 1340. Luther and later reformers were influenced by these notes. Initial letters were inserted by hand. We are often asked by serious students what version of the Bible we advise for those who wish the most correct translation. Perhaps the preceding answers the question in part. Very little is to be gained by attempting to choose between the available versions. They are all revisions of each other and, for the most part, are traceable to the first codexes. I have examined many of these newer revisions, and the textual differences are not sufficient to clarify obscure points. It is doubtful that efforts to modernize the King James Version will meet with enthusiastic response or support. The beauty, dignity, and poetry of the Authorized Version have become a part of the subconscious religious instinct in Western man. The only practical alternative is to read the scriptures in the older tongues. The student of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, or Syrian can detect alternate readings of words. He will realize that meanings can be richer and deeper than is generally believed. If, however, he is limited to the English language, or his knowledge in the classical idioms is slight, he may as well assume that the broad framework of morality and ethics in the Testaments is reasonably close to the original. Scholars are working constantly on controversial verses and sections, and their findings are available in learned journals. The illustrations which are included in this video are from original leaves of early Bibles in the library of the Philosophical Research Society. They indicate the format of both manuscripts and famous printed editions, and can be examined in their collection by interested persons. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you very much.